Senior senator is in the House.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Senator Jack Reed is here, and as you know, I like to hit on a couple of the things of the day, but the time is precious, and this is the Senator's actual first appearance on the program. I'm going to give him a late slip, but after that, I think we're going to have a good working session here. Welcome in. Nice to have you aboard. It's just so busy. It's just so busy. Let's go backwards for a second and talk about the wall. It feels like yesterday, doesn't it? Here's a headline that reflects today's news on it, and that is state after state now, 16 states at this point are looking to jump on board. Peter Neronha, the Attorney General, newly elected here yesterday, told us that he's contemplating Rhode Island's involvement in that. He's not yet made a decision. Remember, it was an emergency, sort of.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
Crazy.
Well, he seems to contradict his whole premise that it's an emergency by saying it's not an emergency, so it's not a very compelling argument. It's also, I think, inappropriate since on a bipartisan basis, Congress came together, over 80 senators voted for appropriations bills that did not include his wall, but included limited stretches of barriers, which the experts say is the right approach to it, and also more funds for ports of entry where most, if not, well, most of the drugs come through that we're trying to search. So all in all, there was a huge bipartisan consensus that this was a way to approach border security. Not only did the president reject it, but then he indicated that this was really not an emergency. He was just going to call it one.
Yeah. Welcome. Thanks for coming in. Chasing you around a little bit on the press conferences as the delegation was calling, every week or 10 days during this whole first, what are we going to do with what was the $5.7 billion ask? Right. And then it came down to, 1.65, right. And right. It looked like it was going to happen, and then the shutdown occurred, and then the shutdown ended with him taking credit for ending the shutdown, and then the State of the Union happened, and then we got the 1.375, which he still has not calculated as a couple $100 million less than he had in his hand, and all of that. Let me ask you about the State of the Union. I thought the Democrats in general missed a golden opportunity after the speech to say something like this. Thank you, Mr. President. There's no Mexico, and we're off the concrete wall. We're at steel slats and barriers, and it seems like it's a limited focus. Thank you so much for thinking this thing through and coming to our side. Instead, Schumer the next day is beating him up and telling him to stay out of the negotiations. Nancy Pelosi is doing her thing. You made a couple of, I think, in context, benign comments about it, but in retrospect, should you have embraced him more? Perhaps this would not, the acting out may not have happened?
I don't think so, because frankly, he does not take his cues from Schumer or Pelosi. He takes his cues from media personalities like Rush Limbaugh and Hannity, et cetera, and Ann Coulter, who's now very upset with him.
Yeah.
So this whole notion of kind of an opportunity to negotiate and to do it in a reasonable adult way, I think he's demonstrated constantly that he doesn't do it that way. He will listen to the last shrillest voice he hears, and then he'll make a decision. We assume that with the bipartisan negotiations that went on very thoughtfully between the leaders in the Senate and the leaders in the House, Republicans and Democrats, that there would be acceptance by the president, and he would sign the bill, and we'd be on to the next major issue, and there are many before us. But then at the last minute, he indicated, I think, to Senator McConnell that he would veto the bill we all agreed upon unless there was this a recognition that he declared the emergency. And that's why McConnell came to the floor and said, let's sign the bill, but then I'll support the president's emergency.
One former congressman who is a media pundit suggested that Senator McConnell had to eat a manure sandwich in order to actually support this emergency action. What's the truth behind the scenes? I mean, you guys play your roles, I think authentically, but you play your roles, and then there's the conversations. I mean, are they all just like this?
Well, you know, I've heard many of my colleagues on the Republican side be very frustrated. There's some who've spoken out, few, but some have. Senator Collins of Maine and others, Senator Alexander of Tennessee, about how this is not the right approach. That feeling, I think, goes deeper, but it's not expressed by as many as they should. And part of their feelings, it's one, it just seems it's inappropriate now, but also they're looking ahead to if this becomes a common practice of presidents of disregarding congressional appropriations of funds after they've been negotiated on a bipartisan basis, then they're going to have a problem with a Democratic president. So they understand that. But there isn't sufficient, I think, pushback to the president by the Republicans.
Have you been able to follow and make any sense out of Lindsey Graham's act?
I think Lindsey is somebody who is, one, extremely articulate. I've served with him for a long, long time. I think his major concern, frankly, is that...
Re-election?
I think that's correct. I think he senses that that in South Carolina, President Trump is wildly popular, and that the ability to generate opposition to him, even though I think he would prevail given his service to the state, is such that he goes back and forth. You know, he will go ahead and be the president's defender on one issue and then be very critical on another issue. He's very critical of the Syrian pullout. And we did it together with Senator Menendez in New Jersey. But so often he jumps up and says, no, he's right, particularly on the wall. So I think a lot of it has to do with his election calculations.
He's one to make very righteous speeches. The Kavanaugh hearings, he tried to set the table, you know, for what is righteousness in terms of how the Senate ought to be deliberating that. And then clearly he looks as if he's got his fingers and toes crossed when he goes to defend this emergency action. When you suggest so quickly to me that I'm correct that re-election is a major consideration, what does that say about politics and principle? And how much principle has been discarded right now in Washington for the politics?
Well, I think most of my colleagues have a principled base of their actions.
On both sides?
On both sides, I do. I think there's, given the nature of the institution, given the nature of life, politics is part of the process. There's no discounting that. But I think many of them, if not all, have a sort of start with a sense of principles. Then there may be some adjustments, but I think on some critical issues that they will not vary because they feel it's strongly.
So let me ask you this: is the emergency action critical enough? Is it Syria critical? Is it high security critical? That and I'm not just trying to have you do testimony on Lindsey Graham here, but since we're talking about him as an example. At what point, and what is your sensibility, and what should his sensibility be about what's really the stuff that we're not going to look at our numbers back home about?
Right.
We're just going to stand up because doggone it, that's why I'm here.
Well, you know, he's done that with respect to the operations in the Middle East. He came right out immediately. You know, I don't know how that polls, but that was an instinctual, principled response to. I've seen this development over.
Does emergency action weigh as heavy as that issue?
I think in my mind it does. In my mind it opens up a whole series of unfortunate events. We're taking money from the troops. We are also going ahead and setting a precedent that could be expanded likely by succeeding presidents. And it just seems to be, particularly after this bipartisan legislation, you know, this was a very strong bipartisan statement of what our policy, the Congress policy in terms of spending about security at the border, and the president sort of disregarding that. So I would disagree in the sense with this is an issue that touches, you know, those fundamental principles. But, you know, Lindsey has a right to, and he exercises that right constantly.
Was the deliberation that resulted in 1.375 and not much wall, or barrier, 55 miles. Was it a wink and a nod by the Republicans to the White House in advance that this thing's going to get drilled down, but we know what you're up to? So, or was it Was it something they were hoping wouldn't happen, that they would sell this to the president?
No, I honestly believe that they thought that the consequences of the shutdown were so disruptive to the American public, and it registered very strongly with the American public, and the president was held accountable to it. They could not have another shutdown. And I think what they thought up until the very last moment is that the president would sign the legislation. Of course, he wouldn't give up on the wall, but he would use not an emergency declaration, but he would go ahead and pursue it some other means, put it in his budget for next year, go to the border and make speeches about it, do those things, but not essentially cause this crisis now of the moment, which is the emergency declaration.
You support these lawsuits? Are you discussing any of this with AG Noronha? Do you want Rhode Island to get involved in this?
I think, first of all, we have to see what they're going to do.
Who they?
They meaning the administration. There is some discussion. They apparently will fund it with military construction funds from the Department of Defense. I think you have to look first where the money's coming from. That may or may not give a particular state standing to sue, and that's important.
Meaning if your project's not impacted?
If your project's not impacted, then it's hard to make the case that you received some type of injury that you can argue it in court. That's one aspect. So I think we have to go ahead and wait to what their specific arguments. It's likely to be a statutory argument, not whether the president has the constitutional power to do certain things, but is he following the statutes that we've laid out in terms of using emergency funding for, generally speaking, for military projects, not for civilian projects. So a lot of the argumentation will be, how do you characterize this wall?
Lastly on this, do you get enough constituents voicing their support for Donald Trump on this stuff? And if so, I mean, you're in a blue state. I mean, we know where we are. My radio lines are full of people who want to articulate Donald Trump's brilliance. So it can be a long day. Do you find the same thing happening, or are you isolated from that? Because
no, I think people are rightly concerned about, first of all, without question, the shutdown. I don't think anybody thought that was a wise use of.
That kind of changed everybody's reset, didn't it?
I think it gave people an opportunity to reset and to look and say this, particularly since he basically, it was his doing. He took it on. He said it was mine. I want to shut the government down. And I think one of the sort of implicit ideas that every American has, regardless of where you line up about individual presidents, is that one of their chief functions is to keep the government running. You can disagree with some of the programs, but you got to keep it running. And I think he violated that, and I think that gave people some pause. Then I think this emergency, too, they're nervous. Again, some of the people who are most nervous are the more conservative thinkers who say, well, wait a second, if this is appropriate now, what if another president steps up there? So I think they're looking, frankly, for much more for pushback here appropriately.
All right, when we come back, the latest news on the former acting director of the FBI and his now media tour. Stay with us. So this is giving everybody pause. Here's the latest.
Andrew McCabe says President Trump's decision to fire FBI Director James Comey, who was at the time leading an investigation into Russian election interference, is what triggered a new Bureau investigation into the president in May of 2017.
A crime may have been committed. The president may have been engaged in obstruction of justice in the firing of Jim Comey.
McCabe, who took over as acting director of the Bureau following Comey's firing, said Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein offered to help try and determine if the president got rid of Comey in order to quash the Russia investigation.
In the context of that conversation, the Deputy Attorney General offered to wear a wire into the White House. He said, I never get searched when I go into the White House. I could easily wear a recording device. They wouldn't know it was there.
President Trump tweeted this morning McCabe was fired for lying, and now his story gets even more deranged. He and Rod Rosenstein, who was hired by Jeff Sessions, another beauty, looked like they were planning a very illegal act and got caught. The White House says McCabe was discredited when the Department of Justice determined he lied to DOJ investigators about a leak to a newspaper. He was fired just days before his retirement.
I believe I was fired because I opened a case against the President of the United States.
McCabe denies intentionally misleading FBI investigators and says he's considering suing to get his retirement benefits.
All right, so this is a squabble, but a story underneath it that is highly concerning. The thing that concerns me most about this whole thing is not just 25th Amendment considerations and the like, but that he reports back that a senior FBI agent came back from a highly sensitive security meeting briefing where the president asserted that Vladimir Putin knew more about North Korea's missile capability than the intel community. You serve on intelligence. From 0 to 10, 10 being freak show, how worried are you about this?
Well, the president makes statements both privately and publicly that are disconcerting, particularly when it comes to Putin. He seems to be a very major fan of Vladimir Putin, who is not someone who should be, I think, respected or admired. There's concern, I mean, in his public statements, and then we're hearing all of these discussions that are behind closed doors that, you know, there's already been a record number, or at least a lot of books about inside the White House in the first 2 years. None of them are particularly complimentary to the president in terms of his decision-making process, his comments, what he says. So I think, again, our job is to ensure that we maintain appropriate policies, and when we see suggestions by the president or directions by the president that we don't think appropriate, then we have to make it clear we disagree.
Yeah, well, it's nice to have a committee review and all that kind of stuff, but God forbid we have a situation. The other night, you ever have one of those nights where at 2 o'clock in the morning you get stuck on a movie and you just can't go to bed? I'm watching 13 Days, right? And it's
Sure.
the Kennedys, right?
John
and the
F.
Cuban
Kennedy.
Missile Crisis. And the play-by-play of the crucial changes to the dynamic on a every 30-minute basis, the push by intel on him, his instincts, his brother, his key staffers, the negotiations, the backdoor stuff, all that clinical Tom Brady-like quarterbacking of the national security. And the whole time I'm watching the show, I'm thinking, can this guy do this?
Well,
Are you concerned about that?
That is a serious question, and I'll tell you, it's not just the temperament of the president, although I think that is one of the challenges. It's also the institutional incapacity. You know, we don't have ambassadors in critical countries. You know, we don't have not an ambassador in Turkey. We don't have an ambassador in Egypt. We don't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. We don't have an ambassador in so many countries where you need a State Department presence to make these decisions or to help make these decisions. The National Security Council has been upset several times. They fired McMaster's. They now have Bolton in. We have an acting Secretary of Defense. So one of the
And you got a DNI that's going to get popped here this week, reportedly.
Yeah, that could be the case. Director Coates?
Yeah.
Possibly the case. But so you have a situation where you don't have the institutional capacity that President Kennedy had. The other thing, too, is that, and one of my recollections back is that, you know, President Kennedy learned a lot from the Bay of Pigs about how you can trust some sources and not other sources, have to ask several questions, et cetera. I haven't seen the same kind of maturation in terms of experience from President Trump. And also, coupled with, again, the lack of capacity, you've got a situation where you're not organizationally prepared for shocks to the system.
So let me ask you this. The McCabe saga and Rosenstein's, whether he was joking, sarcastic, or affirmative about at least a fleeting thought of the 25th Amendment and or wearing a wire, both of which I'm sure are going to be he said by the time we're done. Are there moments you go to bed as a U.S. Senator representing Rhode Island thinking that this president ought to be taken out by the 25th Amendment?
First of all, I think that has to be done under the, as I might say, in the Constitution by the cabinet and the vice president by coming forward.
Yeah, but is it your gut? You say, you know what, this guy worries me so much that somebody ought to be talking about this.
Well, again, this is a discussion that's going to come up. It's going to come up in context of the McCabe hearing. Senator Graham has said it. We've talked about it before. He's going to have some hearings about.
Well, he's going to draw them out.
And also, I think on the House side, there'll be hearings with respect to this issue. But
definitely answer. But I'm asking, do you go to bed at night thinking?
My concerns are more specifically, given the situation we have now, if we confront a significant issue, will we be prepared institutionally as well as will the president be prepared temperamentally?
What's the answer?
Those are questions. I think those are huge questions. I think one of the things that we try to do is be proactive, not just simply sit back. He very soon will be meeting again with Kim Jong-un. You know, one of the things that I'm going to try to do before he goes over is publicly sort of indicate that there should be, before he sits down, a list of all the nuclear sites in North Korea, all the capacities, so we have something to talk about rather than sitting down. And so my effort is to try to sort of try to provide the structure when I don't see it's there.
So, short answer, if you could. Is the country security-wise Trump-proof?
I'd like to say there's a short answer to that, but there's not, because the problems aren't so simple, et cetera. And also his actions are not so, at this point, so clear. You know, you have to read between the lines constantly. You're getting backroom stories about what he does and what he doesn't do. I must say, I think when Secretary Mattis was there, I had a lot more confidence in the institution sort of controlling and directing presidential decisions. I think that's less the case now.
Okay. When we come back, we've got a whole minute on the presidential race. Stay with
good.
us. Could go all day on this. Bernie Sanders is in. A handful of senators are in. It must be an interesting environment on the Democratic side right now. Every time you walk around, you're bumping into a presidential candidate.
Exactly.
You have anybody?
No. I think they've got some remarkably talented people in the race, and I have served with them, and I've been impressed with their service.
Has Bernie's time come and gone?
I think he was a whirlwind last time. I think he'll have a harder fight this time because it's not him against, Secretary Clinton. There's a whole host of other people with talents and abilities, and it'd just be harder to stand out as he did against Secretary Clinton.
How thick is the environment right now with so many Democratic senators wanting to be in the race and so many women to change the pace?
I think that's a good sign. I think it's a very good sign if all these people are interested. I think the worst sign would be if no one was coming forward. I think we've got a good crop of people.
We're out of time, but you're running again, huh? Yeah.
I'm going to do my best to serve the people of Rhode Island.
So you're staying in the game.
I'm going to try.
Remember that Trump Park Avenue thing? All he had to do? I think you're in the same boat. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Appreciate the candor. Final word when we come back. Alrighty, good to see the senator. Tomorrow we're going to come back home and talk about a really interesting dilemma in downtown Providence in Kennedy Plaza, and the bus traffic along with the pedestrian traffic along with some of the panhandling challenges has caused a lawsuit by downtown developer and former Providence Mayor Joe Paolino et al., meaning people who live downtown. It's an interesting argument, and I think one that will make you think. So we'll see you tomorrow on that. And of course, don't forget, weekdays 3 to 6 on WPRO, where we take your phone calls. You have a great evening. Good night.